In 1965, Malaysia brutally separated some of the population from their country. They voluntarily declared the territory a separate state. The 360-square-mile island became known as Singapore. The new leader of independent Singapore was Lee Kuan Yew, who was aware of the impending economic disaster. Singapore was in dire straits. Two-thirds of the country's population lived in slums. They were mostly opium addicts. The country had a very mixed population. The violence was increasing day by day. There was no significant industry, so unemployment was high. The country became a new state with no significant wealth. The neighboring countries were rich and powerful. The issue it got worse when the British military was withdrawn from the island because they were taking 20% of its remaining economy home. Singapore then became a violent and impoverished country. $13,000, and currently Singapore is the fourth richest country in the world. Citizens are more educated, healthy, and productive than other countries. It is located in the best infrastructure in the world. It is a leading country in high-tech production and the financial and logistics country of the entire Southeast Asia. But how did they make this impossible possible? How rich? Here's how this small Asian island became one of the best places in the world, please. In the 19th century, there was a powerful company that employed a fifth of the world's population. And the company they lived on their land was the British East India Company. They profited from shipping and trading all over the world. The most profitable product was Chinese tea. The tea was bought in exchange for opium produced in North India. To avoid this cost and to sail safely, they wanted to build a port of their own in the region. So Sir Thomas Raffles, an officer of the British company, built a new port on a sparsely populated island. Took charge of creating the island that was present-day Singapore. The port was to become a free port, meaning that there would be zero taxes for trade or port-related activities. This was a huge advantage over other expensive tax ports in the region, and within just 4 years, the news as a result of the rapid expansion, Singapore attracted thousands of traders from China and India, and the port soon became popular as everyone sought a tax-free port. But due to the lack of political oversight in the region at the time, Singapore became a center for slave trade, gambling, opium dens, violence, and prostitution. However, Singapore's importance and popularity in international trade continued to grow. Even after the opening of the Suez Canal, Egypt's taxes were high and England had to travel 5,000 miles less to trade with China. The demand for shipping increased dramatically by 1900. Singapore became home to more than 200,000 people who came here for a better living than other regions, but soon the progress of Singapore was reversed as the 20th century progressed, as Singapore was not safe from World War II despite being 6,000 miles away from Europe. The Japanese invaded in December 1941. The Malay Islands had already been attacked by the Japanese, and within 2 months Singapore had to surrender despite orders from London on February 15, 1982. Singapore was no longer the jewel of Southeast Asia, but a pile of rubble and neglected from a crippled British society. Singapore was rebuilt. It was absolutely impossible. Everyone started living in slums randomly, and opium addiction started destroying the population, because earlier when the British dominated the region they did not pay attention to the residents, but were busy harvesting their own sugarcane, and did not even stand by the Japanese when they attacked. After colonizing most of the world, they too decided to form their own state and started campaigning. Singaporeans kept their faith in only one person to do it. You, a lawyer by profession, formed the People's Action Party, or PAP, in the 1955 local elections. After successfully winning a few seats, Lee led the independence movement. London was initially persuaded to emphasize the PAP party, mainly with the change of British public opinion in favor of colonization. The process of independence began. In 1959, Lee was then elected Prime Minister of Malaya, which was the only way for Singapore to survive, but a trouble came with the Chinese on September 16, 1963, when the former colonies of Malay Northern Sarawak and Singapore became the Federation of Malaysia. Malaysian elections brought another party to power that promised to protect the ethnic Malays, since at that time, 60% of Singapore's Chinese population lived with the Malays. A racial disparity created. The ruling party regarded Singapore as a political, social, and economic threat, resulting in a national consensus vote to split Singapore against its will into a separate country within just 2 years. Singapore was then independent, but left alone to fend for itself. Yu found himself in an impossible situation where the population had no national identity and no proper habitat, So how can a prosperous nation be created without natural resources? How can employment be created? How can 70% of the country be brought out of extreme poverty by educating them? And create a larger public life where after independence the British Army also left the country, which further damaged the economy and took away many people's jobs. Then he decided that he would take Singapore to the pinnacle of modernity, even if the most difficult thing would be to control the situation in Singapore. His primary objective was to ban the freedom of every individual, to jail political opponents without trial, and to punish violent riots and drug abuse. This would have resulted in the complete cessation of religious violence in Singapore, which was Lee's main objective. He wanted to move a country's economy forward. The main asset of the country was to change the population. For this, the first solution was to solve the housing system of those who were all living in slums at that time in Singapore. 70% of the people lived in temporary structures along the river. So Lee instituted a controversial law that allowed the government to purchase permanent land and build affordable row houses. But Lee did not want his people to be forever dependent on state money for citizens to maintain their homes and build wealth. Share in the prosperity of the country, so people were encouraged to buy houses built by the government at a very low price, and a portion of their income was mandated to be deposited in the government fund. Originally, the savings fund was for pension. Thus, both the people and the government benefited. Gradually, more people owned their own property, as 80% of all Singaporeans began to live in their own homes, which were originally built by the state. Lee knew that to strengthen the economy, he needed to attract foreign investors, so he lowered business taxes and policies, reminiscent of Singapore's historic revolution, and even 10 above wages. Taxes were completely lifted until 1950. He banned labor strikes. He invested heavily in projects to encourage businessmen and create extensive modern industrial zones. Within just 10 years, Singapore scared away investors from Hong Kong and Taiwan. Every year, various engineering policies were introduced to increase the investment of foreign companies in Singapore, so that investors would have confidence. So Lee cracked down on corruption in this country. One of the least corrupt countries in the world, Singapore is ethical enough to give investors confidence to invest money. In the 1980s, Singapore engaged in a petrochemical, pharmaceuticals, advanced computer construction, shipbuilding, chemical manufacturing, and many other businesses. In fact, despite Singapore's lack of oil resources, it was the third largest in the world. Became a refined petroleum-producing country as Singapore became the regional hub of Southeast Asia. They imported crude oil from neighbors and processed and refined it and shipped it around the world. Today, Singapore is one of the richest, most developed, and competitive economies in the world. They are the second largest trading. It operates the largest port and still attracts the third highest foreign direct investment. He took the nation to the highest peak. He passed away on March 23, 2015. The path that Singapore chose may not be impossible for other countries, but so much progress in such a short period of time may be impossible. What are your views about Singapore in our comment box? If you like the video, a like if you can. See you in the next new episode. Thanks.